He expected a black-edged letter announcing the inevitable. He did not expect, years later, to find a queen on a throne of mud and ledgers, in a kingdom he had sent to die. He had given her a tomb, and she had built a fortress. He had left her for dead, and she had, with infuriating practicality, decided to live. He returned, a ghost seeking a quiet grave, only to find the last thing he had ever wanted, a home, fiercely alive and stubbornly his. The solicitor's office was a room bleached of all color and warmth, a fitting purgatory for the business at hand. Dust motes danced like frantic souls in the thin, gray light slanting through the tall, grimy window, illuminating the worn patches on the carpet where countless other desperate hopes had been ground into the floorboards. Alastair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, stood with his back to the room, his gaze fixed on the indifferent London sky, a canvas of slate and smoke. He felt the silence behind him not as an absence of sound, but as a heavy, clinging presence, thick with unspoken desperation and the faint, cloying scent of cheap perfume and damp wool. He was here to acquire a wife, a transaction as grim and necessary as signing a death warrant or selling off a parcel of land his father had gambled away. He had not looked at her, not properly. He had registered a peripheral shape, a sliver of pale skin and dark fabric, a thing to be dealt with, a problem to be solved. His mind, a fortress built of duty and layered with the scar tissue of a decade at war and another in the viper's pit of Parliament, had no room for the particulars of the woman. She was a name on a contract, a key to an inheritance his profligate ancestors had nearly squandered. The terms of his grey tance were as archaic as they were absolute. He must marry within the year, or the vast, unentailed portion of the Blackwood fortune would revert to a distant, grasping branch of the family tree he despised with a cold, precise hatred. And so, he had instructed his solicitor, Mr. Harding, to find a solution. Harding, a man whose soul seemed to have been pressed and dried between the pages of legal briefs, had found one. A merchant, one Cyrus Vance, on the very precipice of debtor's prison, with a daughter of marriageable age. A daughter, Harding had noted with a dry cough, of a somewhat delicate constitution. The perfect candidate. A woman with no family to speak of, no connections to meddle, no social standing to leverage. A woman who would be grateful for the protection of his name, however hollow, and who, if the rumors of her frailty were true, would likely not inconvenience him with her presence for very long. It was a brutal calculus, but Alastair's world was built on such equations. He was a duke, and the duchy was a ravenous beast that demanded feeding. It did not care for sentiment. Your Grace, Harding's voice was a dry rustle of paper, pulling Alastair from his contemplation of the chimney pots. If you would be so good as to peruse the final draft. Alastair turned, and for the first time, he allowed his eyes to fall upon his intended. Alara Vance. She sat in a hard-backed chair, her spine ramrod straight, a posture of defiance that seemed at odds with the slight tremor in her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. She was pale, her skin the color of skimmed milk, and beneath her eyes were faint, violet smudges, like bruises. Her dress was dark, impeccably clean, but visibly mended at the cuff. She was not the wilting flower he had pictured. There was a stillness about her, an unnerving composure that was not the product of good breeding, but of a long and weary acquaintance with disaster. Her eyes, a startlingly lucid gray, met his. They were not pleading or fearful. They were assessing. It was like being weighed by a ghost. Beside her, her father, Cyrus Vance, was a study in disintegration. His face was slick with a sheen of sweat, despite the room's chill. He wrung his hands, his knuckles white, his gaze darting between Alastair and the solicitor, a desperate, fawning terror in his eyes. He was a man drowning, and he was using his daughter as a life raft. Alastair felt a familiar surge of contempt, cold and clean. He had seen men like Vance on the battlefield, the ones who would sacrifice their comrades for an extra minute of life. Alastair ignored him and took the offered documents. He did not sit. He preferred to stand, to maintain the physical advantage of his height, a subtle reinforcement of the power dynamic that governed everything in this room. His gaze scanned the dense, spidery script, his mind absorbing the clauses and conditions with practiced efficiency. Her dowry was a pittance, barely enough to cover the solicitor's fees. In return, her father's considerable debts would be settled. She would receive the title of Duchess. She would be granted residence at one of the Blackwood properties. The contract was a masterpiece of cold-hearted pragmatism. It promised her nothing of him, not his time, not his company, not his fidelity. It promised her only his name and a roof over her head. A very specific roof. Blackwood Manor, he stated, his finger tapping the line. It was not a question. As you instructed, Your Grace, Harding confirmed. The northernmost estate. It has been unoccupied for some time. Unoccupied was a gentle euphemism. Blackwood Manor was a rotting tooth in the jawbone of the moors. A Gothic monstrosity, his grandfather had lost a fortune renovating before abandoning it to the damp and the wind. It was remote, isolated, a place where people were sent to be forgotten, a place to die quietly. The intention was so transparent it was almost vulgar. He felt the woman's lucid gray eyes on him again, and for a fleeting, uncomfortable moment, he felt a prickle of something that might have been shame. He crushed it instantly. This was a necessity. He was saving his house, his legacy, from the grasping claws of his foppish cousin, Cecil. The girl was merely collateral damage. Alara watched the Duke. He was more imposing than she had imagined from the whispered gossip that had trickled down to her father's circles before their spectacular fall from grace. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black broadcloth so exquisitely tailored it seemed a part of him, an extension of the severe, unyielding lines of his body. He moved with a predatory economy. No wasted gestures, no flicker of superfluous expression. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, a face that had seen too much and felt too little. Scars, thin and white, webbed the skin near his left temple, disappearing into his dark hair. War, they whispered. Politics, they murmured. A man hollowed out by duty. She could see the hollowness. It was in his eyes, the color of a winter sea, vast and empty and cold. She had come here today expecting humiliation. She had dressed for it. In her plainest gown, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She had prepared for the leering assessment of a nobleman buying a broodmare, for the pitying glances, for the suffocating weight of her father's shame. She had not prepared for this profound, soul-deepening indifference. He looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture, a line item in a ledger. And in a strange, perverse way, it was a relief. Pity was a mire that sucked you down. Indifference was a clean, hard surface you could push against. Her father began to blubber his gratitude, a wet, unctuous sound that made Alara's stomach clench. Your Grace, I cannot express my Alara. She will be a good wife, a dutiful wife, so grateful. We are so very grateful. Alistair's cold gaze flickered to the older man, and the fawning words died in Vance's throat. The Duke did not acknowledge him. He looked back at the contract, drew a pen from his coat, and signed his name with a slash of black ink. Blackwood. The name was a judgment. He then slid the document and the pen across the polished surface of the table. The silence stretched taut and thin. It was her turn. Her father nudged her, a small, frantic gesture. She took the pen. Her hand was perfectly steady now. The tremor was gone, burned away by a cold, clarifying anger. She was not a daughter being saved. She was a price being paid. She dipped the pen in the inkwell, the scratch of the nib against the thick paper, the only sound in the room. Alara Vance. The name looked small and insignificant next to his monolithic signature. As she wrote, a single, traitorous tear escaped and traced a slow, hot path down her cheek. She was furious with the weakness of it, the betrayal of her own body. The Duke saw it. She knew he did. A flicker, a bare tightening of his jaw, was his only reaction. He did not see a woman's sorrow. He saw an inconvenient display of emotion, a crack in the seamless transaction. The ceremony will be tomorrow. St. Jude's Chapel. At dawn, he announced to the room at large. Be ready, he did not say goodbye. He did not offer his hand. He simply turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, vast emptiness he left behind. The door closed with a soft, final click. Her father slumped in his chair, a puppet with its strings cut, and began to weep in earnest, a mixture of relief and residual terror. Alara did not move. She stared at the closed door, the single tear drying on her skin, feeling as cold and tight as a new scar. St. Jude's, the patron saint of lost causes. The irony was so bitter it was almost funny. She felt a hysterical bubble of laughter rise in her throat and ruthlessly swallowed it down. This was not an ending. It was an exchange. She had just sold her life, what little there was of it, to save her father. Now she had to figure out what, if anything, she had purchased for herself. The chapel was less a house of God and more a stone box for trapping winter drafts. It was small and used and smelled of damp stone and a century of snuffed-out candles. There were no flowers, no guests, just Alastair, looking like a figure carved from granite at the altar, Alara, a ghost in a borrowed gray dress, the weary-looking vicar, and two clerks from Harding's office, dragged from their beds to act as witnesses. The dawn light that filtered through the single lancet window was the color of dishwater, rendering everything flat and lifeless. Alara had not slept. She had sat by the window of her small room, watching the London sky slowly lighten, feeling a strange and hollow sense of detachment. She was a character in a story someone else was writing. The vows were a meaningless drone, words stripped of all sanctity by the cold, transactional nature of their utterance. When Alastair placed the ring on her finger, his skin was cold, his touch impersonal and brief. It was a simple, heavy band of gold, unadorned. It felt less like a symbol of union and more like a manacle. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss. Alastair simply inclined his head, a gesture of finality, and turned away. The transaction was complete. He was now in compliance with his Grey Tant's will. The Blackwood fortune was secure. He had done his duty. Outside the chapel, a carriage waited, its black lacquer gleaming dully in the morning mist. The Blackwood crest on the door, a snarling wolf's head, seemed to mock her. Alastair handed her into the carriage with the same detached courtesy he might afford a stranger, his hand a firm, impersonal pressure on her elbow. He did not get in beside her. "The journey is 2 days," he said, his voice low and devoid of inflection. He stood on the damp cobblestones, a tall, dark pillar against the gray morning. "The driver has his instructions. Everything you require will be provided for. Everything you require to die quietly," she thought. The words were so clear in her mind. It was a shock he did not hear them. She looked at him, at this man who was her husband, this stranger who had purchased her. She searched his face for a flicker of humanity, a hint of regret, a sliver of connection. There was nothing, only a profound, weary emptiness. He was already looking past her, his mind on Parliament, on his accounts, on anything but the woman he had just bound himself to. "I have business in London," he continued, as if she had asked. "Urgent matters for the Crown. I will be detained indefinitely." Indefinitely. It was a sentence. She merely nodded, her throat too tight for words. She would not give him the satisfaction of tears. She would not give him the satisfaction of a plea. She had made her bargain. She would see it through. He stepped back from the carriage door, a signal to the driver. He did not say her name. He did not say goodbye or farewell. He simply gave a final, dismissive nod. He did not look back as the carriage lurched forward. The journey north was a descent into a colder, damper, more desolate world. The neat, rolling fields of the south slowly gave way to rugged, windswept hills, then to the vast, empty expanse of the moors. The sky was a permanent, weeping gray, and a relentless drizzle slicked the windows, blurring the landscape into a watercolor of browns and greens. The carriage was well sprung, the seats upholstered in cracked leather that smelled of mildew and time, but no amount of comfort could alleviate the profound, bone-deep chill that seemed to seep in from the world outside. Alara sat alone, a small, still figure in the cavernous space, the gold band on her finger a cold, heavy weight. Silence was her only companion. The driver, a grim-faced man with a neck like a side of beef, had not spoken a word to her since they left London. They stopped at coaching inns where a room was always waiting, a solitary meal laid out for her. She ate what she could, the food tasteless in her mouth, and retired to cold, anonymous beds where she would lie awake, listening to the rain and the lonely howl of the wind. She was already a ghost, haunting the edges of the world. The cough that had plagued her for years, a legacy of a childhood bout of lung fever, returned with a vengeance, a dry, racking sound in the oppressive silence of the nights. Her body, it seemed, was eager to fulfill its part of the bargain. On the evening of the second day, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a rutted, unkempt track. Gnarled, skeletal trees clawed at the sides of the coach, their branches scraping against the roof like fingernails on a coffin lid. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and decay. Through the mist-streaked window, she caught her first glimpse of Blackwood Manor. It did not rise from the landscape so much as fester in it. A vast, sprawling pile of blackened stone, bristling with gables and turrets and chimneys. It looked less like a house and more like a geological formation, a malignant growth coughed up by the moor. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, smothered entire wings, its dark, glossy leaves like a shroud. Windows were boarded over or stared out like vacant, cataract eyes. The grounds were a wilderness of tangled briars and knee-high, sodden grass. It was a place that had wholly surrendered to nature's slow, inexorable reclamation. It was a tomb. The carriage rattled over a crumbling stone bridge and pulled to a stop before a set of massive oak doors, their iron studs bleeding rust down the weathered wood. The driver climbed down, his boots sinking into the muddy gravel, and opened her door without a word. He pulled down her single, small trunk and deposited it on the ground with a thud. Then he climbed back onto his seat, took up the reins, and without a backward glance, drove away, the sound of the wheels fading into the oppressive, dripping silence of the evening. Alara was left alone. She stood in the fine, persistent rain, a solitary figure before the colossal, rotting facade of her new home. The cold had sunk deep into her bones, and each breath was a painful effort. Her trunk sat beside her in a puddle, a pathetic testament to the life she had left behind. She looked up at the house, at its blind windows and menacing silhouette against the bruised, purple sky. He had sent her here to disappear, to be erased. A wave of despair, so vast and cold it threatened to drown her, washed over her. It would be so easy to simply lie down in the mud and let the rain and the cold do their work. So easy to fulfill his unspoken expectation. A dry, hacking cough racked her body, doubling her over. It was a painful, ugly sound, but as she straightened up, gasping for breath in the damp air, something shifted. A spark of fury, bright and hot, ignited in the cold emptiness of her chest. Fury at the Duke for his callous indifference. Fury at her father for his weakness. Fury at the world for its casual cruelty. And most of all, fury at this house, this waiting grave, for its silent, smug assumption that she would simply lie down and die. No, she would not. With a resolve that felt like swallowing shards of glass, she straightened her shoulders, lifted the hem of her damp skirt from the mud, and walked toward the great oak doors. She raised her fist, the knuckles white and sharp, and she knocked. The sound was small and ridiculously inadequate against the vast, silent stone, but it was a sound. It was a declaration. I am here. After a long, echoing silence, she heard the scraping of bolts being drawn, protesting with a shriek of rusted metal. One of the massive doors groaned open a few inches, revealing a sliver of impenetrable darkness and a woman's face, pale and pinched in the gloom. The woman was old, dressed in severe black, her gray hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bun. Her eyes, small and dark like currants, raked over Alara, taking in her damp dress, her cheap trunk, her very existence, with an expression of profound disapproval. Well, the woman's voice was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. "I'm the Duchess of Blackwood," Ilaris said. Her own voice sounded thin but clear in the damp air. She was surprised by its steadiness. The woman's thin lips tightened into a bloodless line. A flicker of something, disbelief, contempt, passed over her face. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper." His Grace sent no word. "His Grace was detained," Ilara replied, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Nevertheless, I am here, and I would like to come inside." Mrs. Gable stared at her for a moment longer, her gaze of physical weight. Then, with a put-upon sigh that suggested this was a great and unwarranted imposition, she opened the door just wide enough for Ilara to slip through. Ilara stepped out of the rain and into the belly of the beast. The cold inside was worse than the cold outside. It was a dead, stagnant cold, thick with the smell of mildew, cold ash, and the dust of ages. The great hall was a cavern of shadows, its soaring ceiling lost in darkness. Furniture stood shrouded in white dust cloths, like a congregation of ghosts. A grand staircase, its banister thick with grime, swept up into the gloom. The only light came from the single candle Mrs. Gable held, its small flame trembling in the drafts that snaked through the hall like invisible, icy serpents. "Your trunk," Mrs. Gable stated, her tone making it clear she had no intention of helping with it. "It can wait," Ilaris said, her teeth chattering. "Take me to my room." The housekeeper led her up the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing in the crushing silence. They passed down a long, cavernous corridor lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow them from beneath layers of dust. The air grew colder, damper. Mrs. Gable stopped before a door at the far end of a deserted wing and pushed it open. "The north chamber," she announced. The room was large and grand, with a high, ornate ceiling and a vast, curtained bed that looked like a funeral bier. But the grandeur was a mockery. A large, dark stain of damp blossomed on the wall behind the bed. The air was frigid, and a persistent draft whistled through the ill-fitting window frame. A fire had been laid in the cavernous fireplace, but it remained unlit. It was the coldest, most unwelcoming room Ilara had ever been in. It was a room designed to nurture sickness. "I will have a fire lit," Mrs. Gable said, her tone suggesting it was a concession of immense generosity. "Supper is broth. It will be brought up." She turned to leave, her duty, as she saw it, clearly done. "Wait!" Ilara's voice stopped her at the door. "This room is unsuitable." Mrs. Gable turned back slowly, an eyebrow arched in haughty surprise. "Is the room prepared for you?" "It is damp. I require a smaller room, a drier room, one with a fire that can be kept lit," Ilara stated, her voice quiet but firm. The housekeeper's face hardened. "There are no other rooms prepared. This is where you will stay." It was a challenge, a clear and deliberate assertion of her own authority in this house of decay. She was the chatelaine of this tomb, and she would not be usurped by this pale, coughing slip of a girl. For a moment, Ilara felt her resolve waver. She was so cold, so tired. The cough was building in her chest again, a painful pressure. It would be so easy to acquiesce, to crawl into that monstrous bed and let the dampness and the chill claim her. But then she thought of the Duke's indifferent face, of his unspoken command to die quietly, and the spark of fury burned brighter. "Then you will unprepare it," Ilara said, her gray eyes locking with the housekeeper's. "And you will prepare another, a small one, in the south wing if it is drier. And you will move my bedclothes there. And you will light a fire there that does not go out. You will do it now." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a battle of wills, fought in the frigid air of a dying house. Mrs. Gable's face was a mask of thunderous indignation. She had served the Blackwood family for 40 years. She had run this house, in its slow decline, as her own fiefdom. She was not accustomed to being given orders, especially not by a nameless, penniless upstart with the gall to call herself Duchess. But there was something in the girl's eyes, not the hysteria of a pampered lady, but a flat, cold resolve that mirrored the Duke's own. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose and was therefore unbreakable. With a sniff of pure outrage, Mrs. Gable turned on her heel and swept from the room, her back rigid. Alara listened to her footsteps recede down the long, dark corridor. She stood alone in the center of the cold, damp room, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion. But for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like a victim. She had drawn a line. She had given an order. She had refused to be silent. It was a small victory, but in the vast, overwhelming despair of Blackwood Manor, it felt like winning a war. She sank onto the edge of a dust-covered chair, the racking cough finally breaking free. But through the pain, a grim, defiant thought took root. She would not die in this house. This house would learn to live with her. The next week was a blur of fever and chilling sweats, a descent into a private hell walled in by faded, water-stained damask. The small south-facing room she had demanded was an improvement on the north chamber, but only marginally. It was less a room and more a closet, but it was dry, and the small fireplace, when stoked constantly, could produce a circle of warmth about 3 feet in diameter. Within this circle, Alara lived. Mrs. Gable had, with monumental ill-grace, moved a narrow bed into the space. She delivered thin broth and stale bread twice a day, her presence a cold draft of disapproval. She clearly expected this new duchess to be a temporary inconvenience, a brief flicker of life before the inevitable end. And Alara almost proved her right. The journey, the cold, the sheer, soul-crushing weight of the house settled deep in her lungs. The cough became a constant, tearing companion. She drifted in and out of a feverish haze, the line between waking and dreaming blurred. In her lucid moments, she was acutely aware of the house around her. It was not a silent place. It groaned and creaked, the wind moaning in the chimneys like a lost soul. The drip of water from a leaking roof became a form of water torture, a constant reminder of the decay that surrounded her, that was trying to seep into her very bones. She felt the house actively working against her, trying to smother her, to absorb her into its own slow collapse. One afternoon, she awoke to find the fire had died to a few sullen, glowing embers. The room was icy, the cold a physical weight on her chest. The broth on the tray beside her bed was stone cold, a greasy film congealed on its surface. Mrs. Gable had not been in for hours. The message was clear. She was being left to her fate. Despair, thick and suffocating as a woolen blanket, settled over her. This was it. This was the end her husband had intended. A quiet, pathetic fading away in a forgotten room in a forgotten house. She closed her eyes, a sense of weary resignation washing over her. It was too hard to fight. The cold was winning. And then she heard it. Through the fever fog, a sound from outside her window. It was the clear, sharp ring of an axe splitting wood. A steady, rhythmic, and profoundly alive sound. Chop, pause, chop, pause. It was a sound of work, of purpose, of life continuing, indifferent to her own decline. She dragged herself from the bed, her limbs heavy and uncooperative, and stumbled to the window. Down below, in a small, cobbled courtyard, a man was splitting logs. He was lean and weathered, his movements economical and strong. He was not young, but he moved with a wiry strength that spoke of a life of physical labor. As she watched, he paused, set the axe aside, and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He looked up, not at her window, but at the roofline, his gaze critical and assessing, tracking the path of the water stain that she knew must be visible on the outer wall. This was Mr. Thorne, the groundsman, the only other living soul she had glimpsed on the estate. The sight of him, of his simple, purposeful work, was like a splash of cold water to the face. While she was up here, drowning in her own misery, surrendering to the damp and the dark, life was going on. What was being chopped? The world had not stopped. And in that moment, something inside her snapped. A white-hot clarity burned through the feverish haze. She was Alara Vance, daughter of a merchant. She knew numbers. She knew waste. She knew the brutal calculus of survival. She had watched her father's business, once prosperous, crumble under the weight of his own sentimentality and poor judgment. She had spent years trying to staunch the bleeding, poring over ledgers while he wrung his hands and spoke of better days. She had failed to save him, but she had learned. Oh, she had learned. And she was the Duchess of Blackwood. This rotting, dying house was hers. This tomb was her kingdom, and she would not be its final resident. She would be its ruler. She turned from the window, a new and terrible energy surging through her. She was done being a dying woman. It was time to be a living one. Her first act was one of pure, defiant practicality. She stripped the heavy, damp velvet curtains from the window, her weak arms trembling with the effort. They were beautiful once, but now they were just reservoirs of mildew and cold. She dragged them into the hallway with a grunt. Then she went back and, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, shoved her narrow bed directly in front of the fireplace, creating a small, defensible bastion of warmth. She would no longer be a patient in a sick room. She would be a general in her command tent. When Mrs. Gable finally appeared late that afternoon, her face a mask of sour surprise at finding her charge not only alive but upright, Illyra was ready. She was sitting in the room's single chair, wrapped in a blanket, a piece of charcoal in her hand, and a loose floorboard on her lap, on which she was scratching crude columns. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Gable," Illyra said, her voice raspy but firm. "I trust you are well." "I'm not. This is because the fire went out. It will not go out again. You will ensure it." The housekeeper's mouth opened, then closed. "Furthermore," Illyra continued, not giving the woman an inch, "I require the estate account books. All of them, from the last 5 years. Bring them to me here, along with a proper lamp, more fuel, and whatever is left of the supper you failed to deliver at midday." "The books are in the Duke's study," Mrs. Gable sputtered, outraged. "They are private." "I'm the Duke's wife," Illyra countered, her gaze unwavering. "This is my house now. The ledgers are my concern. If you're unable to fetch them, I will find them myself. Though I confess in my current state, I might knock over a few things. Perhaps a lamp. This house seems terribly flammable. It would be a shame." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. Mrs. Gable stared, her face a battleground of fury and shock. But again, she saw that flat, unnerving resolve. This was not a request. It was an order, backed by what she was beginning to recognize as formidable. With another sniff of pure, unadulterated fury, the housekeeper turned and left. An hour later, she returned, followed by a sullen-looking young maid Illyra hadn't seen before. They carried a small mountain of dusty, leather-bound ledgers, a tray with a tureen of steaming soup, and a proper oil lamp. They were deposited on the floor with ill-disguised resentment. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Illyra said, her tone dangerously mild. "You may go." That night, and for many nights after, Illyra worked. Propped up in her bed, surrounded by a fortress of blankets, she descended into the financial heart of Blackwood Manor. The ledgers told a story of catastrophic neglect. For years, funds had been drawn from the estate account by the Duke's London solicitors to pay for what? Tailors, wine merchants, club fees. The beast of the duchy was being fed, but it was this house, this land, that was being bled dry to do it. The income from tenant farms had dwindled as the farms themselves fell into disrepair. Vast sums were allocated for the upkeep of the manor. It was clear from the state of the house that the money had simply vanished into the pockets of suppliers who billed for work never done, or into the sour black hole of Mrs. Gable's household expenses. It was a slow, agonizing hemorrhage. The estate was not just dying. It was being murdered by 1,000 tiny cuts. As her body slowly, grudgingly healed, her mind sharpened. She lived on soup and fury, her fingers permanently smudged with ink and dust. She started making lists. Drastic, brutal, practical lists. Her first official decree was to close off the entire north and west wings of the house. It was a tactical retreat. "We cannot heat what we do not use," she informed a stony-faced Mrs. Gable. "We will live in the south wing. Kitchen, scullery, your room, my room, and 2 others. That is all. Board them up. It will save on fuel and drafts. Next, she summoned Mr. Thorne. He appeared at her door, hat in hand, his face a roadmap of weathered lines, his eyes a cautious, intelligent blue. He smelled of earth and cold air. "Mr. Thorne," she began, gesturing to a chair, an offer that clearly surprised him. "I have been reviewing the accounts." She laid one of the ledgers on the bed. "I see we have been paying the Buick brothers a handsome sum for the last 3 years to maintain the roofs." Thorne looked at the ledger, then at the ceiling, then back at her. A faint, cynical smile touched his lips. "Aye, Duchess. They're handsome payers, the Bewicks. Less handsome with their work. They've not set foot on this property in 2 years, near as I can tell." "I suspected as much," Alara said. "The bill for slate tiles alone would have roofed the house twice over." She looked at him directly. "Can you fix a roof, Mr. Thorne?" He hesitated, studying her. "I can patch one eye. To do it proper, I need help. And lead. And good slate. Not the rubbish they sell in the village." "Then you shall have it," Alara declared. She pushed another piece of paper across the bed. It was a list of assets from a deep storeroom she had found mentioned in an old inventory. Silver candelabra, tarnished and unused. A set of porcelain dinnerware for 50, still in its crate. 3 French clocks that had not ticked in a generation. "Take the wagon. Go to the city. Sell these. Not in the local village. They'll cheat you. Go to Carlisle. Use the money to buy lead, slate, timber, and 2 strong lads who aren't afraid of heights. And pay them a fair wage. Directly." Thorne stared at the list, then at her, a slow, dawning respect in his eyes. He was accustomed to the feckless whims of the gentry. He was not accustomed to this. This was sense. This was practicality. He picked up the list, his rough fingers tracing the elegant script. "Aye, Duchess," he said, and for the first time, the title did not sound strange or forced. It sounded earned. "I can do that." That was the beginning, the practical takeover. While Thorne and his new crew worked on the gaping wounds in the roof, Alara continued her war on other fronts. She discovered the estate was paying a pension to a head groom, though there hadn't been a horse worth riding in the stables for a decade. She terminated the pension with a brutally polite letter. She found they were buying flour and vegetables from the village at inflated prices, while the manor's own vast, walled kitchen gardens were a jungle of weeds and thorns. She descended upon the gardens herself, her hands, soft and pale from a life indoors, soon becoming chapped and raw. The 2 young maids, Mary and Jane, who had been living in fear of Mrs. Gable, were bewildered when the new Duchess handed them spades and showed them how to clear a patch of earth for planting hardy winter greens and potatoes. Mrs. Gable watched from the kitchen window, her face a mask of rigid disapproval, as her ladyship knelt in the mud, her fine dress stained, her hair escaping its pins, looking more like a common farmhand than a duchess. But a strange thing happened. The work was hard, the mud was cold, but the sun on her back was warm. The ache in her muscles at the end of the day was a clean, honest pain, utterly different from the sickly weakness that had held her captive. She was not just reclaiming the garden. She was reclaiming her own body, her own strength. Mary and Jane, at first hesitant, began to work with a quiet willingness, their fear of the old housekeeper slowly being replaced by a grudging loyalty to this strange, fierce new mistress. They began to smile. The house began to change. The constant, maddening drip of water in the hall stopped. The drafts lessened as Thorne methodically sealed the unused wings. The scent of mildew began to recede, replaced by the smell of wood smoke, baking bread from the flour they now milled themselves from their own tenants' grain, and the sharp, clean scent of rosemary from a bush Alara had salvaged in the garden. The great, echoing tomb was shrinking, contracting into a smaller, warmer, more defensible space. It was becoming a home. The final bastion of the old order was Mrs. Gable. She resisted at every turn, with sullen silences, with forgotten tasks, with 1,000 petty acts of obstruction. The final confrontation came on a blustery October afternoon in the kitchen. Alara, reviewing the week's expenses at the large wooden table, pointed to an entry. Mrs. Gable, "What is this charge for French brandy?" "Medicinal purposes," the housekeeper replied stiffly, not looking at her. "My medicine is fresh air and hard work," Ilera said coolly. "The Duke's medicine, I believe, is purchased in London. For whose health is this brandy intended?" Mrs. Gable turned, her face flushed with anger. "I have run this household for 40 years. I do not need a shopkeeper's daughter to tell me how to manage my own kitchen." The insult, sharp and deliberate, hung in the air. Mary and Jane, scrubbing pots at the sink, froze. Ilera calmly placed her pen down. She looked at the housekeeper, her gray eyes as cold and clear as ice. "You are correct. You have run this household. You have run it into the ground. You have overseen its decay, you have padded its accounts, and you have, to the best of your ability, tried to ensure its new mistress followed it into the grave. You have failed." She stood up. She was still slender, still pale, but she no longer looked frail. She looked magnificent. "You have two options, Mrs. Gable. You can accept that I am the mistress of this house and follow my orders without question or complaint. Or you can pack your things. Mr. Thorne is taking the wagon to the village this afternoon. I am sure he can find room for you and your medicinal supplies." It was a declaration of war, and they both knew it. Mrs. Gable stood, her chest heaving, her pride and her position crumbling around her. For a long, silent moment, she seemed on the verge of exploding. Then something in her broke. The fight went out of her, leaving behind only a brittle, bitter husk. "I will require notice," she said, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. "You have it," Ilera replied, without a flicker of triumph or pity. "Be gone by supper time." That evening, for the first time, Ilera ate dinner not from a tray in her room, but the head of the massive kitchen table. Mr. Thorne sat at the other end, his face scrubbed clean, looking profoundly uncomfortable but also profoundly loyal. Mary and Jane sat on one side, quiet but no longer afraid. They ate a simple, hearty stew made with vegetables from their own garden. A fire crackled in the great kitchen hearth. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside it was warm. It was safe. Looking at the faces around the table, at the small circle of light and warmth they had carved out of the vast, cold darkness of Blackwood Manor, Ilera felt a sense of belonging so fierce and unexpected it almost brought her to tears. She had not found a home. She had built one. Alistair rode north in the teeth of a late autumn gale. Rain, driven almost horizontal by the wind, lashed his face and soaked through the heavy wool of his cloak. His horse, a powerful gray stallion, stumbled on the treacherous, muddy track, and he cursed, pulling the beast's head up sharply. He was exhausted, not just tired but worn down to the bone, to the very marrow. The session in Parliament had been a bloodbath, a vicious, protracted fight over a trade bill that had left him feeling flayed. He had won, as he always did, through a combination of ruthless logic, veiled threats, and the sheer, intimidating weight of his title. But the victory felt like ash in his mouth. He had spent months in London, immersed in the world that was his birthright and his prison. A world of smoky back rooms, of whispered deals and public betrayals, of lavish dinners where the smiles were as sharp as knives. He moved through it like a ghost, playing his part, manipulating the levers of power with a skill that was second nature to him. But it was hollowing him out. Each day, he felt a little more of himself being scraped away, replaced by the cold, hard shell of the Duke of Blackwood. His London townhouse, a masterpiece of Palladian elegance, felt like a beautifully appointed cage. The faces of his peers, of his political rivals, of the grasping mothers and their simpering daughters, all blurred into one. He had even endured a visit from his cousin, Lady Beatrice, a woman whose ambition was matched only by her vapidness. She had simpered and flattered, her eyes glinting with a predatory light as she hinted at the convenience of his wife's reported ill health. The encounter had left him with a profound sense of disgust. He was fleeing. He hadn't admitted it to himself until now. As the moors opened up around him, vast and empty and blessedly free of people, he was running from the noise, from the politics, from the suffocating weight of his own life. He was seeking silence. He was seeking a grave, and he knew just the place to find it. Blackwood Manor. The thought of it had been a small, dark comfort in the back of his mind for months. The tomb he had sent his inconvenient wife to. He imagined it as he had last seen it in his mind's eye, silent, decaying, surrendering to the elements. A place where the world could not reach him. He had received no word from the estate, which was exactly what he had expected. Harding's office continued to remit the funds for its upkeep, a cost he barely noticed. He assumed the housekeeper, a dour but reliable creature, was managing the slow decline. As for the woman, he pictured a headstone in the small, overgrown family cemetery. Alara, Duchess of Blackwood. It was a morbid thought, and the coldness of it should have disturbed him. It did not. It was merely the logical conclusion of the transaction he had set in motion. He was returning to the scene of his crime, not out of guilt, but out of a perverse need for the quiet finality he imagined he would find there. As he crested the final rise, the house came into view through the driving rain, and he stopped. Something was wrong. He had a soldier's eye for a landscape, an instinct for detail honed on battlefields where a misplaced stone could mean an ambush. His mind held a clear image of Blackwood Manor, a dark, sprawling ruin, half swallowed by ivy, its silhouette ragged and broken. The house before him was different. The first thing he noticed was the smoke. Not the thin, pathetic wisp he might have expected from a single hearth, but a thick, steady plume of white smoke rising from a chimney in the south wing. It was a defiant, living breath against the gray sky. Then his gaze sharpened. The gates, which should have been sagging on their hinges, were straight and true. The track leading to the house, while still muddy, was clear of the worst of the overgrowth. The tangled wilderness of briars that had choked the forecourt had been ruthlessly cut back. And the house itself, it was still a Gothic beast of a place, but it was no longer a corpse. Entire sections were visibly, deliberately boarded up, giving a blind, fortified look. But the windows of the south wing were clean, and through the rain, he could see the unmistakable, warm flicker of lamplight within. The ivy had been hacked away from the stone, leaving raw, clean scars. There were men on the roof. Even in this gale, two figures were moving about, securing a flapping sheet of lead. This was not a tomb. This was a fortress. A profound sense of dislocation washed over him. This was not the place he had come to find. This was not the silence he sought. This was occupied, defended, alive. A slow, cold anger began to build in him. This was his house, his place of refuge. Who had dared to interfere? Who had dared to change it? He spurred his horse forward, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a sharp, aggressive curiosity. He rode under the repaired stone archway and into the courtyard, swinging down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop. As his boots hit the gravel, the main door opened. A man he recognized as the old groundsman, Thorne, stepped out. He was holding a lantern. "Your Grace," Thorne said. There was no deference in his tone, only a kind of wary, challenging stillness. "We were not expecting you." "Evidently," Alistair said, his voice clipped. He threw the reins of his horse at the man. "See to my horse, and tell me what in God's name has been happening here." Thorne did not flinch. He took the reins, his gaze steady. "The Duchess has been happening here. Your Grace," he nodded toward the lit windows. "She's in the study. She'll be wanting to see you." The Duchess. The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. He had almost forgotten her name. Alara, the pale, silent girl from the solicitor's office. He had a fleeting, disjointed memory of a single tear on a white cheek. He had dismissed her from his mind so completely that the idea of her being a tangible, active force was ludicrous. He strode past Thorne and through the door into the main hall. The change was even more jarring on the inside. The cavernous, ghost-filled space he remembered was gone. The north and west wings were sealed off by massive, rough-hewn wooden barriers, turning the vast hall into a more contained, defensible space. The air no longer smelled of mildew and rot, but of beeswax, wood smoke, and something else, something savory and warm from the direction of the kitchens. The floor was clean. The oppressive dust was gone. A fire, a massive, roaring beast of a fire, blazed in the great hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the stone walls. It was disorienting. It was wrong. He followed the sound of a low murmur of voices and the scratch of a pen toward a door he remembered as leading to a disused morning room. He pushed it open and stopped dead in the doorway. The room had been transformed into a study, an office, a nerve center. Bookshelves, salvaged from other parts of the house, lined one wall. Maps of the estate were pinned to another. And in the center of the room, at a massive desk that Alistair recognized as his grandfather's, sat the Duchess. She was not the frail, fading creature of his memory. Her dark hair was coiled in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, but strands had escaped to curl around her face, which was no longer ghostly pale, but flushed with warmth from the fire. Her dress was simple, a dark wool, but there was an ink smudge on her cheek and another on her finger. She was leaning over a ledger, her expression one of intense concentration, a pen in her hand. A young maid stood beside her, pointing to a line in the book, and the two of them were speaking in low, serious tones. The room was filled with her presence. It was her command center, and he, the Duke of Blackwood, was an intruder. She looked up as the draft from the open door hit her. Her gray eyes widened for a fraction of a second in genuine surprise. Then, her expression became utterly, unnervingly smooth. She put down her pen. "You're alive," he said. The words were blunt, accusatory, torn from him by the sheer shock of it all. A small, slow smile touched her lips. It did not reach her eyes. Those remained as cold and clear as a winter sky. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she replied, her voice a low, cool murmur. The sheer, audacious irony of it hit him like a physical blow. He had sent her here to die, and she was apologizing for failing to do so. He had expected to find a ghost, and instead, he had found a queen on a throne of his grandfather's making. The power dynamic he had taken for granted, the one that had governed their brief, brutal transaction in London, had been utterly and completely upended. He was standing in her house. He was the one who was unexpected. He was the one who was out of place. He took a step into the room, his boots loud on the polished floorboards. The young maid scurried away, terrified. Alara did not flinch. She simply watched him, her hands resting on the open ledger, a gesture of ownership, of command. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, gesturing around the room, at the maps, the books, the roaring fire. "This house, he couldn't find the word. "Functional," she supplied, her voice laced with a delicate, cutting sarcasm. "Yes, we've been working on it. It's a dreadful habit I've picked up. Functionality. You'd be surprised how it grows on you." He walked toward the desk, his anger a cold, hard knot in his gut. This was his. The desk, the house, the ledgers. She had no right. "These are my accounts. This is my study." "Indeed," she said, her gaze dropping to the book before her. And in a truly shocking state they were, too. The amount you were paying for wine in London could have re-leaded this entire roof. Twice. But I'm sure it was very good wine. She tapped a column with a slender, ink-stained finger. "I took the liberty of reallocating some of your disposable income toward necessities, like keeping the rain out. I do hope you don't mind." He stood before the desk, looming over her. In London, a man in his position, with his height and reputation, could make a woman like her shrink with a single glance. Alara did not shrink. She leaned back in her chair, a picture of calm, regal composure, and looked up at him. She was waiting, challenging him. "You have overstepped yourself, madam," he said, his voice a low growl. "Have I?" she countered, her eyebrows rising in feigned innocence. "I was under the impression that my duties as Duchess included the management of the household, or was my only duty to expire in a timely fashion. Your instructions on the matter were somewhat vague." The truth of the accusation, so baldly stated, struck him silent. He had no answer to that, none that would not condemn him utterly. He saw it then, in the cool, intelligent depths of her gray eyes. She knew exactly what he had intended for her, and she had refused, not with hysterics or pleas, but with ink and ledgers and hard, relentless work. She had fought him not with tears, but with pragmatism. A part of him, the part that respected strength above all else, was grudgingly impressed. The rest of him was furious. She had taken his sanctuary, his place of quiet decay, and filled it with life, with purpose, with her. This house was to be left as it was, he said, the words sounding weak and petulant even to his own ears. As a ruin? As a monument to neglect? She asked, her voice sharpening. Forgive me, Your Grace, but I have no interest in being the caretaker of a tomb. I am in the business of survival. And this house, like me, has decided to survive. He stared at her, at the flush on her cheeks, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the smudge of ink that seemed more a badge of honor than a mark of carelessness. He saw the woman she had become, forged in the cold and the damp, tempered by loneliness and defiance. She was not the pale, frightened girl he had married. She was magnificent, and she was in his way. The days that followed were a silent, undeclared war fought in the corridors of the South Wing. Alistair, accustomed to his authority being absolute and unquestioned, found himself in the bizarre position of being a guest in his own home. He was an intruder in the tight, efficient ecosystem Alara had built. The house ran on her schedule, her routines. The small staff, Thorn, the two maids Mary and Jane, and a new cook Alara had hired from the village, looked to her for orders, not him. They treated him with a wary, distant respect, the kind one afforded a dangerous but ultimately irrelevant visitor. He tried to reassert his control. He strode into the study the morning after his arrival, intending to take his rightful place at his desk, only to find Alara already there, deep in conversation with Thorn about the drainage of the east pasture. They both looked up at his entrance, paused their conversation with polite patience, and waited for him to speak, as if he were a child interrupting their work. The unspoken message was clear. This was her domain. Frustrated, he retreated to the library, a vast, cold room he had ordered to be reopened, and spent the day surrounded by the dusty, unread books of his ancestors, the silence he had craved now feeling like a form of exile. He was a stranger here. The comfortable, well-oiled machine of his London life had no purchase in this place. Here, a man was judged not by his title or his wealth, but by his utility. And he, the Duke of Blackwood, was utterly useless. He did not know how to patch a roof, or analyze a soil sample, or make a dwindling supply of firewood last through a storm. He knew how to command armies and bend parliaments to his will, skills that were of no value whatsoever within the warm, firelit walls of the world Alara had created. Their interactions were brief, sharp, and charged with an unspoken tension. They took their meals together at the massive kitchen table, a habit Alara had instituted and refused to change for his benefit. The silence between them was a weapon. He would sit at the head of the table, a thunderous, brooding presence, while she would discuss the day's work with Thorn, her voice calm and practical, pointedly ignoring him. It was a masterclass in passive aggression, and it drove him to a quiet, simmering fury. I have instructed the cook to prepare dinner in the dining hall tomorrow, he announced one evening, breaking the tense silence. We will cease this rustic performance. Alara took a delicate sip of her soup before answering. The dining hall is in the north wing, Your Grace. It is unheated and unlit. Furthermore, we do not have the staff to serve a formal meal, nor the inclination to eat one. We will continue to eat here. She did not look at him as she spoke. She was addressing the table at large. I am the Duke of this house, and I am giving you an order, he said, his voice dangerously low. She finally turned her head and met his gaze. Her gray eyes were flat and unyielding. And I am the one who ensures this house has a roof and its inhabitants have food. If you wish to eat a cold meal alone in the dark, you are welcome to it. We will be here, in the warm. Thorn choked on a piece of bread, trying to disguise it as a cough. The maids stared at their plates, their faces frozen. Alistair felt a muscle jump in his jaw. He was being managed, dismissed, and utterly outmaneuvered by his own wife in his own kitchen. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly on the stone floor, and strode out of the room, the silent victory hanging in the air behind him. The crisis, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, insidious creep. The relentless autumn weather was the catalyst. A week of freezing rain and howling gales saturated the world, turning the grounds into a quagmire and finding every last, tiny weakness in the old house's defenses. The cold was a living entity, pressing against the windows, seeping under the doors. Alara, who had driven herself relentlessly for months, began to falter. Alistair noticed it first as a subtle change. The flush on her cheeks became too bright, too hectic. The cough she had seemed to conquer returned, a dry, persistent hack that she tried to suppress. She grew quieter during their silent meals, her contributions to the work discussions with Thorne becoming more clipped. There were new, darker smudges beneath her eyes. He watched her, a detached, clinical observer, telling himself it was merely a matter of curiosity. He told himself he was waiting for the inevitable crack in her magnificent armor. One afternoon, he found her in the study, slumped over her desk, her head in her hands. The ledgers were open, but she was not reading them. She was just sitting there, utterly still. "Are you unwell?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. She looked up, and he was shocked by the undisguised exhaustion in her face. Her eyes were glassy with fever. "I am tired," she admitted, her voice a thin whisper. "The numbers, they're not making sense today." "Then you should rest," he said, the practical advice sounding strange and inadequate. A ghost of her sharp, sarcastic smile touched her lips. "Rest is a luxury the accounts do not currently permit, Your Grace. The winter seed needs to be purchased." She tried to stand, but swayed, her hand flying to the desk to steady herself. In 2 long strides, he was beside her, his hand closing around her arm to keep her from falling. The heat radiating from her skin through the thin wool of her sleeve was alarming. She was burning with fever. "You are ill," he stated, the obviousness of it a dull shock. "I am fine," she insisted, trying to pull away, her pride a fierce, reflexive thing. But her strength failed her. Her legs buckled, and he found himself holding her full weight. She was terrifyingly light, a collection of sharp angles and fierce will, wrapped in a body that was failing her. For a moment, he froze. He was a man of action, of decisive commands. But this was a situation for which he had no training. This was not a battle. It was not a debate. It was a woman, his wife, collapsing in his arms. With a curse, he swept her up. She weighed almost nothing. She gave a small, protesting murmur. Then her head fell against his shoulder, her body surrendering to the fever. He carried her out of the study and up the stairs to her small room, the one she had claimed as her own. He laid her on the narrow bed, her face stark and pale against the pillow. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. The dry cough shook her slight frame. He stood over her, a giant in the small, cluttered room, feeling a profound and unnerving sense of helplessness. He had sent her here to die, and now she was dying. And the thought, which had once been a matter of cold, logical calculus, now filled him with a raw, unfamiliar panic. The maids, Mary and Jane, appeared at the door, their faces pale with alarm. "It's the lung fever, Your Grace," Mary whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It took her like this before, when she first came." "Fetch cold water and cloths," he commanded, his voice regaining its familiar tone of authority. It was a relief to have an order to give. "And keep the fire stoked." "Huh, do you understand?" They scurried away to do his bidding. He was alone with her again. He looked down at her face, at the vulnerability that the fever had stripped bare. The fierce queen of the ledgers was gone, replaced by a fragile, struggling woman. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he laid it on her forehead. The heat was terrifying. For the next 3 days, Alistair did not leave her side. The hollowed-out Duke, the man who had retreated from all human connection, found himself forced into the most intimate of roles, a caregiver. He shed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and set to the grim, practical work of keeping her alive. He learned the rhythm of the fever, the way it peaked in the dead of night, leaving her delirious and muttering about crop yields and leaking roofs. He held her down when the chills racked her body, his own large frame shielding her. He bathed her face and throat with cool water, his touch, which had always been for command or violence, becoming surprisingly gentle. He forced her to drink, tipping water and thin broth past her lips a spoonful at a time. He learned to listen to the sound of her breathing, the rasp and crackle in her lungs becoming the new focus of his entire world. The vast concerns of the duchy, the fate of nations, the machinations of Parliament, they all faded into an insignificant hum in the face of the elemental struggle for breath happening in this small, fire-lit room. The maids helped, bringing food he barely touched and fresh linens, but he did not relinquish his post. Thorne appeared at the door once, his weathered face etched with concern. "Is there anything, Your Grace?" "Keep the house running," Alistair had replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Do what you would do." Thorne had simply nodded, a look of profound understanding in his eyes, and left him to his vigil. On the third night, the crisis came. Her breathing grew ragged, shallow, each breath a desperate, losing battle. The fever spiked, and she began to ramble, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was fighting, not him, but some unseen enemy, her hands pushing weakly against the blankets. He sat on the edge of the bed, his own exhaustion a heavy, leaden weight, and watched her slip away. The panic he had felt before returned, sharp and cold, and laced with a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion, fear. He was afraid of losing her. He, who had faced down cannon fire without flinching, was terrified of the silence that would follow her last breath. "No," he said, the word a raw sound in the quiet room. "You will not." He remembered something from the battlefield, a brutal, desperate measure for men with fluid in their lungs. It was a risk, but the alternative was a certainty. He hauled her into a sitting position, ignoring her weak struggles. He propped her against his own body, her back against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder. He could feel the frantic, failing beat of her heart against his ribs. Then he began to methodically, rhythmically, pound on her back with the heel of his hand. It was a harsh, jarring treatment. She cried out, a thin, weak sound. He ignored it, his face set in grim lines, his entire being focused on the single, desperate task. He was fighting for her with her. He was forcing the life back into her. After what felt like an eternity, something shifted. She was seized by a violent, racking series of coughs. It was a terrible, wet, productive sound. He held her tightly, murmuring words he wasn't aware he was speaking, nonsense words of encouragement and command. "That's it. Fight. Breathe." Finally, it subsided. She lay limp against him, utterly spent. But she was breathing, deeply, evenly. The terrible, rattling sound was gone. He gently lowered her back onto the pillows. Her eyes were closed, but the frantic, feverish tension had left her face. Her skin, though still hot, was slick with a healthy sweat. The fever had broken. He sank back into the chair, his body trembling with reaction. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness, but also something else. A quiet, fierce satisfaction. He had faced the enemy in this room, and he had not lost. He looked at her, sleeping a true, healing sleep for the first time in days, her dark lashes stark against her pale cheek. The ink smudge was still there. He reached out and, with the pad of his thumb, gently wiped it away. The gesture was small, unconscious, and more intimate than any he had ever shared with another living soul. He had saved the woman he had sent to die, and in doing so, he had, without realizing it, saved a part of himself. He sat there in the firelight, watching her breathe, and for the first time in a decade, the hollow space inside his chest did not feel quite so empty. The dawn that broke after the fever was pale and quiet, the storm having exhausted itself in the night. A fragile, watery sunlight filtered into the small room, illuminating a world washed clean. Alara woke slowly, feeling as if she were surfacing from a great and turbulent depth. The first thing she was aware of was the absence of pain. The fire in her lungs was gone, replaced by a clean, cool emptiness. Her body felt weak, boneless, but it was her own again. The second thing she was aware of was him. He was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head slumped forward, his long frame folded awkwardly into the small space. In sleep, the harsh, formidable mask of the Duke had fallen away. The lines of exhaustion and strain were carved deep around his eyes and mouth. His dark hair was disheveled, a lock of it falling across his forehead. He had a 3-day growth of beard, a dark shadow on his sharp jaw. He looked younger, more vulnerable, and more human than she had ever seen him. His coat was gone, his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, scarred forearms. One of his hands rested on the blanket near her own, his long fingers relaxed in sleep. She lay still, watching him, trying to piece together the fragmented, feverish memories of the past few days. She remembered the cold, the pain, the struggle for breath. And through it all, she remembered a constant, grounding presence. A low voice, murmuring. A cool cloth on her forehead. Strong hands holding her, steadying her. A jarring, rhythmic pounding on her back that had felt both violent and life-saving. It had been him. All of it. He had not let her die. He had fought for her. The thought was so staggering, so contrary to everything she knew and believed about him, that she could not fully process it. This man, who had dismissed her with such cold finality, who had treated her as an inconvenient necessity, had stayed. He had nursed her. Why? Out of duty? A belated sense of responsibility? She could not fathom it. He stirred, a low groan escaping him as he shifted in the uncomfortable chair. His eyes opened, bleary at first, then sharpening with focus as they landed on her. He saw that she was awake, her gaze clear and lucid. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost palpable, washed over his face before he could mask it. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low, rough rasp. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she whispered, the echo of their first confrontation a fragile, tentative bridge between them. A faint, weary smile touched his lips. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his harsh face completely. "Don't. You gave me something to do." The silence that fell between them was different. The sharp, weaponized quiet of their previous encounters was gone, replaced by a soft, shared weariness. It was the silence of survivors after a battle. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting, and walked over to the fire, stoking it back to a cheerful blaze. He then poured a cup of water from a pitcher and brought it to her. He didn't call for a maid. He simply held the cup to her lips himself, his hand steadying the back of her head. She drank, the cool water a balm to her dry throat. His proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the faint, masculine scent of him, of soap and wool, and the faint, metallic tang of exhaustion. It was grounding, real. "The accounts," she murmured, the old anxieties stirring. "The seed. Thorne is handling it," he said, his voice firm, cutting off her protest. "He came to me yesterday. The ledgers are a mess, apparently." He looked at her, and there was a new expression in his eyes, something that looked almost like respect. "He said only you would be able to make sense of them." I told him he would have to wait. He confessed his own inadequacy so simply, so matter-of-factly, that it took her breath away. He was ceding control, acknowledging her expertise. It was a bigger concession from a man like him than any flowery apology could ever be. Later that day, after she had managed a little soup, he brought a small, rickety table to her bedside and a single, formidable-looking ledger. He did not question her. He did not offer to help. He simply placed it where she could reach it, along with a pen and ink. "Don't overdo it," he said, his tone gruff, almost clumsy with an unfamiliar concern. And so, a new routine began. A truce. In the quiet days of her recovery, they started to exist in the same space. He would sit in the chair by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes just staring into the flames, a silent, watchful guardian. She would work for short periods on the accounts, her mind slowly regaining its sharpness. The silence was no longer a battlefield. It was a shared territory, a quiet space for healing. One afternoon, she was struggling with a column of figures, her mind still fuzzy from the fever. "I can't make it balance," she said in frustration, more to herself than to him. He got up and came to the bedside. He leaned over, his presence large and warm beside her, and looked at the page. His scarred temple was only inches from her own. She could feel the heat of his body. "This supplier," he said, his finger tapping a name, "Blevins. He's a known cheat. My father used to complain about him. He inflates his invoices by a third and hopes no one will notice." She stared at the ledger, then at him. "How did you know?" "Some things a duke does learn," he said with a wry, self-deprecating twist of his lips. "Mostly how to recognize a thief." He took the pen from her unresisting fingers, his touch sending a jolt through her, and made a swift, authoritative correction to the numbers. "There. Now it balances." He handed the pen back to her, and for a moment their fingers brushed. It was a simple, accidental contact, but it felt like a brand. It was not a romantic touch. It was a touch of partnership, grounding, anchoring. They were two people working on a shared problem. As she grew stronger, she began to take short walks, first in the corridor, then down the stairs, leaning on his arm. His support was steady, impersonal, yet profoundly comforting. She, who had prided herself on her independence, found herself relying on his strength without resentment. He, who had walled himself off from all human contact, found himself offering it without a second thought. They began to work together. It happened naturally, without discussion. She was the strategist, the master of the ledgers and the land. He became her enforcer, her instrument in the outside world. When a tenant farmer proved recalcitrant about a new crop rotation she had designed, Alastair rode out. He did not threaten. He simply sat on his large gray stallion, the full, formidable weight of his title and presence radiating from him, and spoke in low, reasonable tones about the benefits of her plan. The farmer, who had been arguing with Thorne for a week, agreed in 5 minutes. They spent an afternoon in the study, which had become their shared space, going over the estate maps. She pointed out areas of marshy, unproductive land. He, with a soldier's eye, suggested a series of drainage ditches, sketching them onto the map with a confident hand. They fell into a natural rhythm, her intricate knowledge of the estate's needs and his broad, strategic thinking complementing each other perfectly. One evening, they were in the kitchen. The maids had gone to bed, and Thorne had retired to his cottage. A sudden, late storm had blown in, and the wind was rattling the windows fiercely. Alara was kneading dough for the next day's bread, finding a familiar comfort in the simple, physical task. Alastair sat at the great table, cleaning a piece of tack, his movements precise and economical. The only sounds were the howl of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the soft thump of the dough on the floured board. "I never learned how to do any of this," he said, his voice quiet in the shared intimacy of the late hour. He was not looking at her, but at the piece of leather in his hands. "How to run a house, how to make things work. I was taught how to command, how to fight, how to rule from a distance. I was never taught how to live in a place." It was a confession, a statement of his own failure, offered up into the warm, quiet air. Alara paused in her kneading, her hands white with flour. "I was never taught how to be a duchess," she replied, her own voice just as quiet. "I was taught how to count pennies, how to turn a profit, how to survive when the floor falls out from under you." He looked up then, and his gaze met hers across the table. In his eyes, she saw the hollowed-out spaces, the scars left by his past. And he, in hers, saw the steely resilience of a survivor. They were two sides of the same coin, both damaged, both forged in different fires. "You are a better duke than I am, you know," he said, the admission costing him a visible effort. "You have saved this place." "No," she said, turning back to her dough. "We have," though we hung in the air between them, a fragile, powerful thing. It was an acknowledgement of their partnership, their shared purpose. The storm raged outside, but inside the kitchen, within the fortress they had built and defended together, there was a profound and unexpected peace. He was no longer the haunted duke, and she was no longer the pragmatic survivor. They were simply Alistair and Alara. And they were, for the first time, home. The arrival of the royal courier shattered the fragile peace of Blackwood Manor like a stone through a glass window. He arrived on a lathered horse, a splash of official, scarlet-coated importance against the muted greens and browns of the moorland. He carried a dispatch sealed with the king's own crest, an urgent summons that represented everything Alistair had fled. The world, with all its demands and its duties, had found him. Alara saw the courier from the study window. Her heart, which had been slowly, cautiously unclenching over the past weeks, seized into a tight, cold knot. She knew, with a certainty that was absolute and devastating, what it meant. He would leave. Of course, he would leave. His time here had been an aberration, an interlude forced by circumstance and her own inconvenient illness. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a pillar of the realm. His life was in London, in the halls of power beside the king. It was not here, in a half-reclaimed ruin on the edge of nowhere, with his temporary, transactional wife. When he came into the study a few minutes later, the dispatch in his hand, she had already rebuilt her walls. Her face was a smooth, polite mask, her posture erect, her hands folded neatly on the desk before her. She was once again the cool, efficient Chatelaine, the woman who ran his house, not the woman who had shared quiet evenings and worked beside him as a partner. "A summons from London, I presume," she said, her voice perfectly level, betraying nothing of the sickening lurch in her stomach. "You will need to pack. I will have Mary see to it. When do you leave?" Alistair stood in the center of the room, looking at her. He saw the change in her instantly. The warmth and cautious openness of the past weeks had vanished, replaced by a brittle, formal courtesy that was more distancing than any anger could ever be. She was already pushing him away, preparing herself for the abandonment she saw as inevitable. She was treating him like the man who had arrived months ago, not the man who had sat by her bed and held her through a fever. And it hurt. The realization that it hurt was a shock in itself. "There is a crisis in the cabinet," he said, his gaze fixed on her face, trying to breach the wall she had thrown up. "A matter of foreign policy. The king requires my counsel." "Of course," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "The duchy requires its duke. Your horse will be ready within the hour." She picked up her pen, as if to return to her work, a clear, cutting dismissal. He did not move. He simply stood there, the royal dispatch a foreign object in his hand, a symbol of a life that no longer felt like his own. He thought of London, the noise, the treachery, the crushing, soul-deep exhaustion of it all, the endless, meaningless performance of being the Duke. He thought of his perfectly appointed, empty townhouse. He thought of Lady Beatrice's grasping, predatory smile. And then he looked at the room around him. He saw the maps on the wall, with his own sketches marking new drainage routes. He smelled the familiar scent of beeswax and old paper. He looked at Alara, at the fierce, proud set of her shoulders, at the ink smudge she had missed on her knuckle, at the magnificent, infuriating, resilient woman who had taken his tomb and filled it with life. His life. His duty. For his entire life. That word had been his compass and his cage. Duty to the title. Duty to the family name. Duty to the crown. It had been an abstract, bloodless thing, a god that demanded endless sacrifice. But looking at Alara, at the home they had forged together from mud and ledgers, he finally understood what duty truly was. It was not an abstract concept. It was this land, this house, this woman. He walked slowly toward the fireplace, where a low fire burned against the morning chill. Alara watched him, her hand frozen over the ledger, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. She did not understand what he was doing. He stopped before the fire. He looked at the royal seal, at the elegant, demanding script. This was his past, his prison. He had a choice. For the first time in his life, it felt like a real one. He could return to the cage, or he could stay in the fortress. With a quiet, deliberate movement, he tossed the dispatch into the flames. Alara gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. The parchment curled, blackened, and was consumed by the fire, the red wax of the royal seal melting like a drop of blood before disappearing into ash. It was an act of treason, an act of rebellion, an act of utter, shocking finality. He turned to face her. The firelight flickered on his face, illuminating an expression she had never seen before, not of command, not of weariness, but of quiet, profound certainty. "My business in London is concluded," he said, his voice low and resonant in the sudden, ringing silence. "My urgent matters are here." She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could not speak. She could not process the enormity of what he had just done, of what he was saying. He crossed the space between them and came to stand before her desk. He did not loom over her this time. He simply stood there, vulnerable, his hands empty. "For years," he began, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name, "I believed my home was the duchy. An idea, a title, a responsibility. I was wrong." He reached out, not to touch the ledgers, but to gently take her hand, the one with the ink smudge on the knuckle. Her skin was cool, and she trembled at his touch. "This is my home, this place you have built, this life you have made." He looked directly into her eyes, and the last of his own walls came down. She saw everything there, the scars, the hollowness, but also a new, dawning light, a desperate hope. "You are my home, Ilara." The words, so simple, so direct, shattered the last of her defenses. The queen of the ledgers, the pragmatic survivor, the mistress of the fortress, finally broke. A single tear, like the one in the solicitor's office so long ago, escaped and traced a path down her cheek. But this was not a tear of sorrow or fury. It was a tear of overwhelming, terrifying, magnificent relief. It was followed by another and another. The fortress had been breached. She stood up, her hand still in his, and he drew her around the desk and into his arms. She went without resistance, her body molding against his as if she had been made to fit there. She buried her face in the rough wool of his coat, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. She was not just crying for the joy of this moment, but for all the lonely, desperate moments that had come before. He held her, his arms a strong, steady circle around her. He did not offer empty platitudes or try to quiet her. He just held her, his hands stroking her hair, his chin resting on the top of her head. He was an anchor in the storm of her emotion, a solid, unwavering presence. He had spent his life running from this kind of connection, this kind of messy, profound vulnerability. And now, holding her, he felt not trapped but free. Outside, the wind picked up, a harbinger of the coming winter. But inside the study, wrapped in each other's arms, they were warm. They were a permanent fixture against the cold, too broken has made whole. The house around them, no longer a tomb but a living, breathing entity, seemed to settle into a contented silence. It was theirs, fiercely alive and completely whole. And the coming winter held no fear for them at all.